First up, we'll have Richard Banfield, who's our very own VP of Design Transformation here at InVision. He also happens to be the author of our own book on enterprise design sprints, and he's going to give us some practical guidance on how to run a remote design sprint effectively. And just as a side note, Aaron and I have done remote design sprints for our teams here at InVision a number of times, and they are surprisingly easy if you know how to prepare for them.
That's right. And next up, Alison Rand, our Senior Director of Design Operations, is going to share with us the inner workings of how our design teams here at InVision, working remotely, run design reviews in a way that just ensures that the work is visible across all teams.
Our hope is that these two experts will make your remote life easier, whether you're new at it or whether you're a pro. And as Hunter S. Thompson says, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro.
That's right. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode.
I've worked with lots of search firms, both as a leader searching for new talent for my teams, and as an individual exploring new steps in my career. But I trust none more than Wirt & Company. Since 1995, Wirt & Company has been the design community's most trusted search firm, co-founded by a designer and led by a CEO who has in-house operational startup experience. Wirt & Company is guided by the principle that creative leadership is essential to business success. They've helped some of the most admired brands from early-stage startup to Fortune 500 build world-class creative teams. We're talking about companies like Airbnb, the New York Times, the Four Seasons, Notion, Figma, Google, Cartier, and Fair. Not bad. If you're looking for a partner to help you find the right person for a critical role, look no further than Wirt & Company. And if you're looking for your next design leadership role, Wirt & Company will guide you through the process as a friend and a champion throughout your journey. They take the time to get to know you, to understand what you need professionally and personally. Whether you're looking for your next role or your next team member, Wirt & Company can help you find a meaningful relationship. Visit wirtco.com to learn more and get in touch. That's WERTCO.com. Support for Design Better comes from Gusto, who make running a small business easy. Get 3 months free at gusto.com/designbetter once you run your first payroll. Running a small business is hard work, especially all of the payroll, quarterly tax filing stuff, and HR things. I'd rather be focused on my business and my customers than dealing with the administrative duties. But Gusto makes it easy. They automated the complicated parts of running a business. With Gusto, I never miss federal or state payroll tax filings, and I love the time off requests and time tracking tools. Gusto even offers a small group health insurance option for nearly any budget. When you run into issues you need help with, their HR experts are ready to help. It's a very well-designed product, easy to use, and great emotional design that will put a smile on your face. Design Better listeners get 3 months free once they run their first payroll. Just go to gusto.com/designbetter. That's gusto.com/designbetter.
Richard Banfield, VP of Design Transformation here at InVision. Welcome to the Design Better podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be back with you guys.
Great to have you. Richard, given current circumstances and the fact that a lot of people are moving to a remote team situation, we thought that would be an interesting thing to discuss today. And in particular, you wrote a book for us on design sprints, so maybe we could start off by just discussing some of the best practices and potential pitfalls for facilitating and running a remote design sprint.
Yeah, they are probably one of the most popular ways of getting people in a room to collaborate. And one of the things we've noticed about facilitating or participating in a design sprint is that not much is that different between the physical world and the remote world. But what we notice about the remote environment is that a lot more preparation is required because of the opportunity for potential miscommunication or misunderstanding, or even the lack of relationship building for those people who may not have worked or collaborated together. It's really important to over-index on getting folks ready for that experience. So where a design sprint might kick off with just a small amount of preparation and then proceed through the 5 phases, now what we're finding is that with a remote design sprint, or any kind of collaboration for that matter, the amount of time that you would invest in preparing is going to be significantly more. So the phase 1 might actually be a preparation phase, or phase 0, if you will. And we do discuss a little bit of that in the book, but I think there's an amplification here. We've turned it up to 11 on the preparation scale.
So talk to us specifically. What are the types of things that would require additional preparation?
The most important thing is to make sure people understand why they are there, like why they have been invited, why they are participating, what's the potential outcome, why do they need to invest this much time and this much effort into something that is potentially disruptive to their day. So they've got a requirement to be participating or collaborating with others for a couple of days. Maybe it's 4 or 5 days in a traditional sense of the design sprint being 5 phases. That might mean they're being pulled away from work, and they really need a good reason to justify that, either to themselves or to their leaders. So what we often do is write something up that will explain what is going to be done, what the outcomes are, the benefits to them, the benefits to their team and to their business unit, for example. And then we would circulate that to both them and their leaders, so their leaders are completely aware. So just like sometimes you see those documents on the conference websites, convince your boss. This is a little bit like that. It's, why should we do this? Why? Convince yourself, convince your boss, tell us why you need to be there. And then beyond that, you also want to make sure that folks are understanding of what's required of them once they do show up. So what are we going to be doing each day? What does that look like? What do these exercises require in terms of attention? Are we going to be working in breakout groups, or are we going to be working as a collaborative team? What tools will we be using? Do you know how to use those tools? So for folks like you and I, we use Zoom and Slack and all these remote tools every day because we're a remote company. But for a company that isn't familiar with that, you want to make sure that those people that have been invited definitely know how to use those tools. So you might want to have a pre-game version of the design sprint where you all get together. Let's make sure that your tools are ready, that you've downloaded the right things, that you know how to use them. Where the mute button is, for example.
Right.
And just making sure that everybody's comfortable so that it doesn't feel like a baptism of fire on day one.
You have a nice quote in the sprint guide that you put together for the book, that a good facilitator is more like a rudder and less like an engine. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, bringing the right mindset and energy to a remote sprint like this.
The idea behind that is that you want your team to be empowered and enabled to do the best work that they can do in these collaborative exercises. The facilitator is not there to make decisions or demand a certain kind of outcome, but rather allow the group to find their way through these different exercises towards an answer or a solution, and just make sure that they don't get off track. Essentially be a guardrail for them, give them guidance as they need it, make sure that they're participating in the way that was agreed to at the beginning. Because if you read the facilitation guide, one of the most important things you do is come up with a set of agreements that how you will behave, how you will treat each other, rules, if you will. Things like only one person speaks at a time, that we put away our electronic devices, that we are hard on the ideas, but soft on people. And I think those kinds of things just need to be reminded from time to time. We just need to bring some clarity to some of these decision-making exercises. And really that's the goal, is to not be a leader in the kind of old-fashioned traditional sense, but be a servant leader to the process.
Richard, so much of the original ideas around design sprints are so physical. So we time exercises with tools like a time timer, which is a popular, actually a kid's kind of Montessori school way of visually timing exercises. We have exercises like Crazy Eights, where we take a piece of paper and we fold it 1, 2, 3 times to be able to get 8 rectangles where we can draw 8 solutions to one common problem within 5 minutes. So these are just a couple of examples, but there's so many other examples that are just woven into the fabric of the design sprint process that leads many of us to believe that design sprints are a thing that are only achievable in a physical IRL, in real life experience. Talk to us about how we rethink those tools and physical processes for remote so we can work with design teams across locations. We might have a design team in Dublin and a design team in Austin if you're IBM. Or we might have gone through a global pandemic and the entire design team is scattered to many locations, maybe in the same city. How does that work when everything feels so physical in a design sprint?
I think the most important thing when you're doing any kind of collaborative exercise is to understand that the tools are there to amplify the work that you do. They're not there to do the work for you. And the most important thing that the collaborative group can do is assume a type of collaborative mindset. And so both for the facilitator and also for the group, the mindset is going to be really important. Once that has been established, then the tools could be anything. They could quite literally be like freehand, which is our virtual whiteboard that we have at InVision. And as long as you've got the tools that are able to draw that mindset out of those individuals and make them feel comfortable, then you've got a winning set of tools. So in our case, we ran, I think it was September last year, a design sprint for about 110 people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember that, what we did is we trained the facilitators. So we had about 10 facilitators to first start with a group and then use the various Zoom breakout tools and the whiteboard functionality of freehand to set everybody up so that they could independently work as small teams of 8 or 9 people. And those teams were able to whiteboard their ideas, collaborate. So using Zoom as the way to visually represent themselves and freehand as a way to represent their work, they were able to see the work, collaborate, and distinguish between their ideas and somebody else's ideas. And that means the same for somebody who's sharing an idea on a real whiteboard as it does for somebody who's sharing an idea on a virtual whiteboard. There were things that we did to make it a little easier. So before anybody started, we asked them to draw a flower pot, and then we asked them to create something that would allow a household to display flowers. So the two differences between that is, one is just letting you free those kindergarten muscles and remind you what it looks like to draw again, because some of us have forgotten.
Sure.
And the other part of the exercise is to distinguish between just the task of drawing and also the exercise of experiencing something. And those subtle differences are both right and left brain exercises that we use to both set the mindset and also get people used to the tooling.
Towards the end of the sprint comes the testing portion, and obviously there may be some unique challenges in testing your prototype remotely. Maybe you could speak to that.
This is actually quite interesting because the nature of user testing or testing ideas has actually been remote for some time. This is the one part of the design sprint that is probably about as remote as it gets. So for many teams, they were taking the prototypes that they had created and sharing those through a screen with a remote tester and using maybe Zoom to capture the facial expressions and the micro expressions of somebody interacting with the product and watching the screen and seeing how they interacted with the prototype to see what the experience was with the test. So the remote part of user testing is actually a familiar territory for many researchers and UX people. Designers tend to prefer that. It's a much smaller effort to get somebody to participate in a remote testing environment than it is to try and have them come over to your office or you go to their office. I think in some cases it's probably very relevant to be in situ with them to see, maybe if it's service design, you want to see how they're interacting physically with an environment. But for the kind of work that product designers are doing in the digital sense, remote is actually the easiest and best approach to doing this anyway. So it really fits in quite nicely with the way that we're headed.
So just walking through all of these stages of the design sprint, early on, we might be doing some research, talking to customers. That's something that's easily done through something like Zoom, where we can record and kind of gather all the insights.
Mm-hmm.
We can synthesize those in some tool like Google Drive, create a doc of all of those things. create ideation sessions with teams, doing things like Crazy Eights, using a virtual whiteboarding scenario like freehand, which is what we've used in the past. And we've done some super detailed drawings of people and situations. So you get a sense for not just what the UI looks like, but where are the people, how are they working and interacting? And then you can start to prototype some of these solutions with something like Studio or Sketch and build an interactive prototype. Of course, our tools do that as well. And then test it with real people at distance too. Is there anything that's missing? Like, is there a gap between a remote sprint and a physical sprint where remote has to make some sort of trade-off?
I think remote has to be, like I said, a lot more prepared and intentional. There's less chance for you to build those kind of personal relationships that you might have in a group, in a room, like you would. So for example, let's break it down into little pieces. When you're in a room together with people, you can read all of the other nonverbal cues. You can look at their faces, you can see their body language, you can see whether somebody's checking their phone or whether they're actually engaged in the exercise. All of those cues are not quite as visible, or maybe in some cases invisible to you. So the facilitator needs to be both a lot more aware of the things that they can control and see, and also set the stage so that the things that they want to happen actually do happen. So I think in the case of running a remote sprint, you want to make sure that you've spent enough time preparing and getting the team ready for that work. It'll get easier over time. We used Slack as a way to create individual channels for each of the teams that were working together. And those Slack channels persisted long after the design sprint. So those are one of the asynchronous advantages to having a remote design sprint, because we were using tools that we would use not only in the design sprint, but would be using post-design sprint. And really, that's the purpose of a design sprint, is to create some kind of momentum, give you answers that you can then go and use in your follow-on sprints, in your follow-on work. So we were really priming the pump, if you will, and getting folks ready for that kind of work before they even needed to. And I think that's where the advantage of remote is going to be felt and seen, is that we're giving people a head start with these tools so that it's not disjointed. As you said, hey, I'm in a room, but now I'm going to leave that room, I'm invisible. So being invisible outside of the room isn't very helpful to somebody who's trying to create something.
Yeah.
I think remote has allowed us to prepare for that and then follow through with that.
So this is actually one place where a remote sprint has an advantage, which is that all the work is being created digitally. And so it's documented, it's shareable, it's archivable, it's packaged up nicely in a way that it can turn from ideation into actual production.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we haven't really spoken about much here, but is inherent in any collaborative work, is the ability for the team to start to relate to each other. And anything that the facilitator and the team can do to make sure that we're understanding of each other, that we're inclusive of all the voices, that everybody gets a chance to participate, that's really the value of it. I mean, if you really break it down, a design sprint or any of the collaborative exercises that teams are using these days, they're really just a sneaky way to get people to work together. They're a way to help people get a lot closer and a lot more trusting in a shorter amount of time. So it's the replacement of the not so popular trust fall. Now suddenly we've got something that not only creates trust, but it also generates answers and solutions that can be used in the workplace. So it has so much more value. And I think as we live in this new remote world, or this new world order that we're experiencing through this pandemic, we're starting to see that this is not a bad alternative or a poor alternative, but in fact a much better alternative in some respects. And it's going to make us smarter about what we do, how we prepare, how we interact, how we capture. And ultimately that'll make us better than when we go back to the real world and do these design sprints in person. We'll start to find that the skills that we honed and developed during those remote times are going to be a lot more valuable.
So that's a really good segue to the topic of just building trust generally in a remote team, and maybe some of the obstacles and opportunities there. Richard, maybe you could talk with us a little bit about your thoughts on that topic.
I think trust is what we're all trying to work towards, right? We know that it's difficult to work with people in general, just because the world has become very complicated and we're producing very complicated things. And when you're producing complicated things and you've got a complicated environment with lots of different devices and platforms and technologies, it's going to be challenging to bring people together. And the key to bringing people together is assembling some level of trust, because not only are you asking somebody to operate in this complex environment, but now we're asking them to operate remotely where you can't necessarily see them working. You've got to just trust that they are working. So trust has become more important than ever. And a trust isn't a thing you show up with and just hand out. It's not like Post-it notes you can stick on a wall. It's something you create or is a symptom of all the other things that you do. So I'll give an example. If you and I reach an agreement and I say, I'm going to do certain things for you, and you say, great, I agree that those are the things that we want from each other, and then I'm unable to do them or I don't do them, then we've reduced the ability for us to create trust. So reliability is one of those things where if I say I'm going to do something and I do it, that leads to an increase in trust. But like many things, it's a flywheel. If I continue to do things in a reliable way and I continue to uphold the social contracts that we have between us, trust increases. So we can actually expand trust by continuing to participate in that agreement flywheel. I agree with you on something. I show you that I'm reliable. You develop trust. You give me more things to agree to, and that trust develops. And I think that's very possible to do in any environment, remote or otherwise. You just have to spend the time creating those agreements. And I think that's the hardest part, is that we sometimes substitute the work that's required to get to an agreement with things like process. We might say, well, we have a process. Process will help us get stuff done. Or we might say, well, we have an office and people come into the office and they're sitting there, so they must be busy. And I think the assumption that people are in an office or that are even on a camera, I think I've heard of some awful stories where companies are actually videoing their staff or their employees as a way to make sure that they're doing work. I think that assumption that people are working just because you're watching them or because they're in an office is very dangerous. Just because they're there, it doesn't mean they're doing the things that you've agreed to. It certainly doesn't mean good communication's happening or good collaboration's happening. So I think the remote environment is an exceptional place for trust to happen, because you have to come to those agreements and you have to give trust in order for remote to work. And again, just like we discussed with the design sprints, if you can create that in a remote environment, can you imagine how wonderful it would be to see that then back in the office when that time comes for us to all be together again? You've created a skill, you've honed a capacity, and you've exercised a muscle that is now so good at developing trust in this environment, which is by its very nature something you have to create trust in. And then taking it back to the office, I think it's going to be a force multiplier.
Richard, you described trust as more of a byproduct of other behaviors and activities. And one thing that I was surprised by, going from working at a company that was always IRL to a company that's rarely IRL, I had a lot of preconceived notions coming in that remote would be less personal, less connected, because we're so far apart and we know each other, but sometimes like we don't even know how tall one another is. It's like we know each other, but then when we meet in person, it's like cognitive dissonance. I know you, but I've never seen you before. It's kind of a weird thing to process. But one thing that has been really surprising to me about remote is that empathy is so much easier to come by, because we're connecting to our personal spaces. So when I talk to you, when I talk to Eli, when I talk to our colleagues, I am seeing your home. I'm seeing your personal space that reflects who you are. Sometimes I'm seeing your children, your family, your pets show up, and I start to have an understanding of colleagues that's more personal than I did in a real environment, where after working with people for years and years, I never met their spouse, I'd never met their kids. I didn't feel like I really knew them as human beings. I only knew them professionally. And being able to build that empathy so easily and remote is surprising. And it's such a powerful foundation upon which trust is built, because when I understand colleagues understand them as humans, not as, you do work and I hope that you will contribute to the thing that I'm trying to get done as well, it shifts mentality. It's easier to say in my mind, well, we all have good intentions. We're all humans with the same types of emotions that kind of peak and manifest at various moments in our lives. I wondered, in your transition from running Fresh Tilled Soil, an agency, moving over to InVision, if you had similar observations or maybe different observations about how that was different for you.
Yeah, well, everybody should know that Aaron's much taller than he really is. At Fresh Tilled Soil, we had been remote for a few years, but we had been in an office in a studio for about 12 years prior to that. And we had invested a lot of time and money and effort into these beautiful studio spaces, as most agencies of the time had. We'd taken a lot of thought and effort into creating an environment in which our customers would see us as being the creative hubs. We wanted people to walk in and say, wow, this is where creativity happens.
Mm-hmm.
So when we made the choice to go remote, and of course the transition again, when I came to InVision, I was very conscious of the fact that we had to design an experience. So I was kind of cheating because we would design experiences to begin with, but we really thought about it. We mapped it out, and we looked at all the potential problems that we might face and thought about what will we be missing, what will we be gaining, and where can we amplify the things that are great and maybe downplay the things that are not so great. And for us, a lot of it was about what you've just mentioned, and that's relating to each other. So for those who are listening to the podcast, they can't see that behind me is an art collection. They can't see that behind Aaron is his record collection. We did things like that deliberately so that we could create conversational starters. We wanted our customers to see who we were, to represent who we could be in their lives, and immediately start a conversation about that. We didn't want it to be business, business, business all the time. We wanted to create personal connections. And so we were very intentional about things like that. And I like the fact that we can do that. It's almost cheating to me, because I can share a passport of my experiences with you in an instant,
Mm-hmm.
which I can't necessarily do in an office environment.
Mm-hmm.
You may see the personality of the company, but you may not ever really understand who I am and what my environment is like. And you certainly won't see my 4-year-old coming to sit on my lap,
Mm-hmm.
which might sound like a nightmare BBC scenario where that guy lets his kid run in. But in fact, I find that to be, again, like I said, it feels almost cheating. I'm able to create massive amounts of empathy with a customer. We were on the call with one of our biggest customers, WPP, this morning, and they were all working from home, and we were all working from home, and we were talking about that, and we were talking about our spaces and our lives and our families. And I don't know if that's always going to be the case in an office environment.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think it does. I think there's the water cooler conversation, but this is a different kind of water cooler conversation. It's maybe a little bit more personal, like you said, a little bit more empathetic than the facade that I might have at the traditional water cooler.
Are there any other tactical tips that you might have for having a good remote working setup, whether that's your desk in your office, anything like that? I mean, sharing a personal example, I'm probably known a little bit through our company for having a standing walking desk. So oftentimes in meetings, I'm getting a couple steps in. So I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks in that realm.
I'm a little easily distracted, so I like two types of environments. I like an environment like the one that you're currently looking at, where it's well engineered for the experience of talking to other people. And then I have a standing desk as well, which is very engineered for my personal happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things could be combined. If I was as smart as you, I could probably do both. But in my particular basement office environment, I've created 2 different situations so that I can allow my distraction to become something functional. So I can walk over to the standing desk and spend an hour there and then come back to the sitting desk. And it just, for me, the change of scenery also means a change of the work that I do. So this is the space that I sit at where I'm doing meetings, where I'm sitting and talking to other people. The standing desk is the place where I go to do my writing and the heads down work that I need less distractions for. So yeah, I think everybody's going to have their own environment. So to say, are there tips and tricks? I'm sure there's a million out there. I would suggest to people that they dive deep into who they are and how they work and figure out how they can amplify the things that they're really good at. And then also remove the distractions that they know they're going to be, well, depending on your environment. I'm speaking from a pretty privileged place where I have a basement and I can sneak away from the fridge. But those people who know that they're going to be distracted by a pet or a fridge or something like that, they may want to kind of organize that environment or design that environment differently. So I think it's less about what works for all of us and much more about what works for you and how can you amplify the things that work for you.
It's fantastic. Richard, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for letting me come on this wonderful show.
Hopefully you found Richard Banfield's take on running remote design sprints useful, telling us how to build trust between teams who are new to being distributed, which is such an important thing.
Now we're going to take a listen to Alison Rand, who's our Senior Director of Design Operations here at InVision, and she's going to coach us on design reviews and on keeping work visible.
Support for Design Better comes from Gusto, who make running a small business easy. Get 3 months free at gusto.com/designbetter once you run your first payroll. Running a small business is hard work, especially all of the payroll, quarterly tax filing stuff, and HR things. I'd rather be focused on my business and my customers than dealing with the administrative duties. But Gusto makes it easy. They automate the complicated parts of running a business. With Gusto, I never miss federal or state payroll tax filings, and I love the time off requests and time tracking tools. Gusto even offers a small group health insurance option for nearly any budget. When you run into issues you need help with, their HR experts are ready to help. It's a very well-designed product, easy to use, and great emotional design that will put a smile on your face. Design Better listeners get 3 months free once they run their first payroll. Just go to gusto.com/designbetter. That's gusto.com/designbetter. Support for Design Better comes from Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery. Design Better listeners can save 50% on their order at factormeals.com/designbetter50. Use the code designbetter50. You know what happens at my house when things get really busy? In the evenings, we turn to takeout, which can be expensive and it's not very good for our health. Lately, we're making a better choice at crunch time. We turn to Factor for chef-created, dietitian-approved meals that are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. We like the flexibility of Factor, too. You can change your order up every week with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, or you can pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. The meals are so tasty. My wife and I are huge fans, and I like their smoothies, too, which I find are perfect for a quick, healthy breakfast. Factor can help you eat well and feel good while focusing on your career and your family. Head to factormeals.com/designbetter50 and use the code designbetter50 to get 50% off your order. That's code designbetter50 at factormeals.com/designbetter50 to get half off your order. Support for Design Better comes from Uplift Desk, who help you work better and live healthier. Eli and I log a lot of hours at our desks, which can be detrimental to one's health if you're not paying attention to ergonomics. Uplift Desk offer high-quality, well-designed desks, chairs, and accessories to help you build an ergonomic workspace for home or work. Eli recently got a standing desk, and I got a human-scale Freedom chair. I've been dreaming about this chair for a long time, and I finally got one. I've already noticed a big change in my posture with this chair, and my body thanks me for it. Eli is logging a lot more hours standing than sitting these days, and he can make quick transitions with the flip of a switch. We love Uplift Desk, and we know that you will too. Design Better listeners can get a special deal by visiting upliftdesk.com and use the code DesignBetter at checkout for 5% off your order. You'll get free shipping, free returns, and an industry-leading 15-year warranty. Go to upliftdesk.com, use code DESIGNBETTER, and get 5% off. Design a better workspace with Uplift Desk.
Alison Rand, Senior Director of Design Operations here at InVision. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
We are particularly interested in the work that you're doing. You joined InVision not too long ago, right?
Not too long ago. It has been less than a year. I believe about 8 months at this point.
And you joined from
Automatic.
Automatic, also a totally distributed remote company, one of the biggest in the world as far as we know, right?
1,200 people, I think. I was just listening to Matt Mullenweg on a podcast yesterday.
Yes, that's where I've come from. So I've been doing this for a while.
So remote is native for you. How long were you at Automatic?
I was at Automatic for a year and a half.
Okay. And here at InVision, of course, if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast, you've heard some of our colleagues, and we've also mentioned there that InVision is a totally distributed company. We have no headquarters, and we love that. But it does pose some unique challenges for a number of design teams, how to make work visible to a lot of people, and also just core design practices like design reviews. Our friend Bob Baxley, formerly of Apple, now at ThoughtSpot, he is a firm believer that the design review is the heart and soul of the design team. So maybe we could start there, Alison. Tell us a little bit about leading design operations here and formalizing some of these processes in a remote environment. How do you guide our product and design team with respect to design reviews?
I believe one of the first mandates for someone coming into a design ops role is to kind of assess the landscape and get a sense of what is or is not visible. And really fundamental to the role is that bridging capacity. So how are we connecting across the organization? I think about design ops as a much more horizontal role than a vertical role. So oftentimes when I'm starting in a job, I spend a good amount of time just going deep on talking to people, doing my own discovery and research, and getting a sense of where the gaps and opportunities are. And I often find that it is in this visibility and it is in this disconnect that naturally, organically forms in zones and squads and disciplines and teams, whatever. So one of the first things that I have tried to implement at InVision, which had been happening before I came, but is a weekly, what we call a weekly science fair, which is a broader design review. And the reason why it's called science fair, and this was being done in our studio zone, is because we wanted designers to get more comfortable with sharing work that's kind of new, raw, experimental, or from low fidelity to high fidelity, and to give everybody the opportunity to see work in progress across the design organization. Because oftentimes, and we do also have design crits within zones and squads, but oftentimes our designers, especially, I mean, I think this happens in real life. It certainly happened at Frog, where I was for many years, don't even see each other's work. So it's really helpful to set this time every week where we have less of a transactional discussion, and it's also not a crit, and more of just like a visibility conversation opportunity to see what's happening across the org. And also the ability to see work early and make sure that we're heading in the right direction, as well as see ideally the process from start to finish if everybody's showing their work on a regular basis.
To be kind of tactical about it, are there any tools or artifacts that you lean on to help make work more visible across teams?
For a while, we had been using Wake, which is one of our tools to provide more visibility across the zones and the work that was happening. And that was before I started, where weekly everybody would upload their most recent work into Wake, and they'd go through it, and it was just a sort of like run through of all the work that was being done. For me, I think it was really great for everybody, but from my perspective, it felt a little bit too transactional, and I really wanted to again make it feel more relational. Right now, though, we've actually moved just into Google Slides. super low fidelity where we drop in whatever types of work that's being done and link off into a freehand or into a prototype or whatever it is. But that's kind of our central hub of operations for reviewing the work. And then we make sure that everything's recorded and posted in Confluence. And then monthly, when we do a broader review, which is our actual hour-and-a-half meeting where everyone comes and they show all of the work consolidated to that date for each zone, we pull all of that information into a newsletter and we share that out across engineering, product, and design.
And just for our listeners who may not know about it, Freehand is another one of our products. It's a virtual whiteboard, so we can draw together, but it's also a place where you could upload screens. Like if you're working on some sort of user journey or a sequence in a product, you can upload that directly and be able to write. I have heard that in our product team, we often like to present screens inside of Freehand because you can draw and make notes adjacently. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that works?
We love Freehand, and at Automatic, we loved Freehand as well. I feel like Freehand is the unsung hero of our product line because it is such a great whiteboarding tool. It reminds me of days when I was at Frog, or we would get into a war room and we would just have a whiteboard and people would start drawing things out. And so oftentimes you can drag in concept screens and you can comment on them. Or I've been doing a lot more workshops in Freehand. So building a lot of workshop frameworks in Freehand and then inviting our teams to kind of, if we're working through our OKRs or we're thinking through the kind of a service blueprint of how process works in our design organization and how we're communicating with engineering, all different ways it could be used. It's pretty flexible in the ways that we use it here, but we use it, I feel like at InVision and at Automatic, we used it for so much concepting.
We use it quite extensively in our teams as well. So Eli and I are inside of the content team, which is inside of the marketing team. I mean, we've done a lot of wireframing, collaborating on higher level strategy things. Sometimes we're drawing out like calendars and timelines because it's just like quick and easy and immediate together.
Yeah.
It's really great.
They get really complicated. I've actually seen one that the people team has, which is amazing, which is pretty deep on our employee experience journey map. They're really interesting, but it's like that hybrid of being able to like low fidelity whiteboard stuff, but also higher fidelity, really map things out.
Could you walk us through what a typical design review looks like? Who's there? How it's facilitated? How do you log the lessons and the feedback? How's the work presented?
So the broader review is more what I was just talking about. That's kind of the weekly all design org. Hopefully we're working towards making that much more cross-functional. In the past, those types of reviews were always cross-functional, which I think is actually really important to get that kind of visibility. But some of the issues with making that cross-functional, I think, are really entrenched in psychological safety because people get really anxious about sharing their work, especially if it's not done. But for our design critiques, those are run at the zone squad level, and those are cross-functional. So they work pretty traditionally. How they work is we usually there's a presenter, there's a facilitator, there's a critiquer. So the presenter is the person who's presenting the work that needs to be assessed. They're setting the scene. They're basically setting the context, being specific about the type of work that's being presented, the level of fidelity it's being presented, and most importantly, the type of feedback they'll be looking for. And we try to really make sure that we keep these to a set time. So if we have an hour and there's X amount of things to review, we usually just say like, okay, so a presenter has 10 minutes and then we have 5 minutes to kind of critique. But oftentimes these we'll be critiquing one thing or two things, so we'll have more time. And the facilitator's job really is it could be anybody. A lot of times it is a design ops role, a design producer or a design program manager, or to facilitate just kind of the time and make sure that everyone understands the work that's being presented and critiqued, encourage the involvement of everybody to make sure that people who are normally quiet speak up, or, not calling anybody out, but making sure that voices are being heard and
Mhm.
that the presenter really gets the feedback that they need. And of course, keeping an eye on the clock. In the past, I had always made it the role of the design producer who is leading that team to be responsible for their notes. So you're responsible for any outcomes that are coming out of this critique. We try to be very mindful of the right types of feedback and the right ways to give feedback. So not just calling out problems, but recognizing what's working well. Also, don't just say like, I love it. What do you love about it? Can we
So
talk
not
about that a
helpful.
little bit? Yeah, it's so not helpful. It's very sweet. And I think people like
Right.
feel that they're being really kind when they say it, but it's just not helpful. And then grounding at InVision, I think it's really, this one's really important, is that we're grounding our feedback in our design principles, making sure that it's not arbitrary often, what the feedback is grounded in. So we're asking or begging the questions of, does this feel familiar? Is it clarifying? Is it inclusive? Does it amplify, whatever problem that we were trying to solve, et cetera? Some of those like foundational principles that we have in design. And then validation around customer feedback. Has this been tested? Have you validated this against industry best practices? Like asking questions and making sure they're not super prescriptive. I think that the format is pretty standard for design crits. A meeting on a regular basis, again, making sure they're super cross-functional, giving everybody the space and time to speak, the facilitator making sure that we're approaching this with the right etiquette. And this is the piece that's, I think, is the most different for remote environments, is making sure that you're not in a loud environment, that you're muted, that you're not distracted, that you're not multitasking, being mindful of your like audible and visual feedback, like,
Mhm.
this is so great, or like your arms are crossed and you're just kind of like with on your face, your body language is reading all no, 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 or yes, yes, yes. And then the temptation to multitask, being present, I think, in remote organizations or distributed organizations is incredibly important and incredibly difficult.
I would agree with that 100% because you're on an interactive device with
Yeah.
lots of notifications and opportunities to chase a thing and feel like you can be doubly productive in that circumstance. It gets very difficult. But I want to just double click on who's in the room for these. So is it just designers, or are there engineers, product people, executives? Who gets invited to a design review?
I think it depends at the level at which we are presenting, but generally it is cross functional. There are engineers, there are product managers, and there are designers. And yeah, so depending on the timing of what needs to be shared is when it gets presented to like up and upwards. So at what point are we presenting to the head of design or to the head of engineering? Like, that's determined by readiness, I believe. Also, our roadmap expectations of when we need to be sharing at that level.
Could you talk more specifically about the framing? So at the beginning of a design review, how do you frame the work, that, the stage that it's at, various information you need to provide everyone in the room?
Well, there's a couple different ways. I like to ask people to frame the work around the problem that is trying to be solved specifically. So that really sets the context. And also, what exactly is being shown? So, is this UX specific type of work, or are we solely focusing on visual concepts? Is this strategy focused? Is this research based? So, just really setting the stage for the problem that's being solved and how specifically we're trying to solve this problem, and how it relates to the overarching customer experience and where we are in the roadmap at that time.
I'm curious if your team has any rituals or practices at the start of these crits that help people get into a more kind of present and mindful state. I know when I teach in person, at least we often do some improv stuff in the beginning of class to get people engaged. I'm curious if either the teams do that or if you think there might be an opportunity to do that.
There's definitely an opportunity on our team. We've been the team that I'm on, which is the centralized design team, and we are currently running our next phase of our design system. And in the past, we've done a little bit of like just circling the wagons of red, yellow, green exercise, like how everybody's feeling in that moment, just to do like a quick temperature check to understand, to kind of read the room, which I think helps as like an icebreaker, so to speak, to get a sense if somebody's like, well, I'm red, and to try to be as honest as possible. I'm red because it doesn't even have to be work related, or I'm feeling green because I'm super, pumped to share this work with you all. We've been working really hard on it. I think that's a nice, quick ritual to set things up. And we've also done, which I've liked in the past, this kind of 5-minute check in and check out, which is similar in some ways. It's like, how's everybody feeling in the beginning, and that red, yellow, green. And sometimes that checkout is just as important. How is everybody feeling at the end after going through this? Some people might be feeling terrible after a crit, or some might be feeling really hopeful, or some might be feeling the exact same way they started. But I like that exercise as well.
So, Alison, with a background working at Frog, a very well-known, successful design agency, it's global, I would assume that Frog has a pretty clear way of running design reviews or design critiques, and that's primarily in person. And then at Automatic and InVision, everything's distributed. When you reflect on your experience at these three places, what's different between a design review in person versus a design review that is conducted in a remote environment?
I would say what's different is probably the hardest part of my job as a design operations leader in a remote world, is that fundamental to my role, to the design operations role, I think it's super relational. So much about the human connection and experience and reading the room and having these relationships with people. I think design crits are really hard for designers. I know design crits are really hard for designers and gives them a lot of anxiety. Even if they were in art school and we're doing it like, forever, it's still an anxious time, especially when you're presenting to your boss or your boss's boss. So when you're in a room together, you could read the room. You can get a sense of how people might be feeling. You could even maybe have gotten a sense of how they were feeling beforehand when you ran into them in the bathroom or grabbing a cup of coffee or whatever it is. There's that part that's really important, of that human connection aspect, to be able to facilitate a room and understand maybe if you need to take a pause or a break, or if someone's feeling anxious or whatever it might be. It's very different in a remote environment when it's nearly impossible to read the room. Oftentimes in the background, I do try to keep my Slack open just for people who feel like if they need to ping me directly when something's happening and they want to just have a quick gut check in, or I can do a quick gut check in with them to make sure everything's going okay, or we need to move along in time, or whatever it is. Like even in a room, you could be like pretending like you're checking your watch, or pointing to your watch, saying we need to move on, and you can't do that remotely. But I think that the relational aspect is what is removed in remote environments. In those types of experiences, it takes a lot longer to get there, and that actually fosters a greater insecurity around psychological safety. And then, of course, the imposter syndrome that runs rampant in distributed organizations. And so put all of that together in this mush of like designers and supporting the share of work that puts them in vulnerable positions in a distributed landscape. It just requires a lot more of intentional, concerted effort to foster community.
So we asked our guest earlier in this episode, Richard Banfield, about any specific tips he has for setting up your environment to be productive and comfortable remotely. Are there any personal hacks or tricks that you have in that realm?
My space is incredibly important to me. I'm fortunate enough to live in a house in New York City where I actually have my own room. Well, I mean, I share my studio with my husband, which is why there's music equipment everywhere. But I find that also inspiring in a certain way. The fact that it's far away from the hubbub of the rest of the house makes it helpful. But oftentimes, I think it's really important, especially working remotely, obviously not during this time, but to be able to get out as much as possible. I feel like those tips and tricks, like setting up your space really lovely and like having a candle that smells really nice is always great. But getting outside of your space is just as important. And so I try to frequent the places that I have memberships to, that I could be surrounded by other creatives, and even if they're like the place that have a membership to, you're not allowed to be on your phone or anything. You have to be really present. You can work, but you have to be present. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff that really feeds me. So I just can kind of go inside out.
Do you move around in your house? Or do you, I always see you in your studio, but do you move around and work in different places?
Not often. This is the thing that I'm sure will begin to come more and more to light now that everyone's working remotely right now, is that you end up in meetings back to back to back, and it's really awkward to eat on a video conference. But sometimes you have to. So often the only other place you'll find me occasionally is in my dining room, and that's usually with the video off as I'm shoving food in my mouth.
Yeah, I can identify with that. Excellent. Well, Alison Rand, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's always great to chat with you all.